Hello and welcome to our guest speaker, Deb Gajic. She is going to explain all you need to know about research methods in psychology. This episode, Deb is giving us information about observations in psychological research. Asking the questions is our host, Blakemore.
Morning, Deb.
Morning, Dorothy.
What research method are we going to look at today?
We're going to look at observations.
Oh, right. So what is observation?
Well, as the name suggests, it simply involves observing participants and noting down their behaviour. There are a couple of pitfalls, though. We have to understand the difference between observation as a research method and observation as a data collection method. So the best way to explain that is to give you an example. So if I got participants to solve a puzzle in a hot or cold room, then I observed them to see how stressed they look. I'm using observation to collect my data. So it's not an observation, it's an experiment, as there's still a clear IV, independent variable, hot or cold room, and dependent variable, how stressed they look. So that wouldn't be an observation, it would be an experiment. So there are two main ways of using observation as a research method. There's naturalistic observation, which again, as the name suggests, people are studied in their natural environment. The researcher doesn't interfere in any way, they're just observing and taking notes. And they're usually looking for a particular type of behaviour before they start. The other type that you'll come across in your A-level studies is controlled observation. Now, unlike a naturalistic observation, the researcher does manipulate the situation here. So in a way, it's a bit like a hybrid between an experiment and an observation, but it still counts as an observation as there isn't one IV or DV. And a good example of a controlled observation would be Mary Ainsworth's strange situation or Zimbardo's prison study. But we're going to focus more today on naturalistic observations.
So what are the main differences between a structured and an unstructured observation?
So a structured observation usually involves a tally chart. So the researcher has decided beforehand what sort of behaviour they're looking at. So for example, if we're looking at aggressive behaviour in children, we might look for, hitting, kicking, verbal aggression, etc. And what the researcher does is simply tick it off on the tally chart when they see it. So structured observation generally generates quantitative data, which is really easy to analyse. But the issue is, because we've started off with behaviours that we think we're going to see, that gives us a problem of researcher bias because there's confirmation bias. We see what we expect. And it also means that sometimes behaviours might occur that we haven't on our tally chart. Now, researchers often have a category of other, but that's a bit unsatisfactory, really. In an unstructured observation, the researcher simply notes down the behaviours as they occur. So they might be getting more qualitative data. It's more in-depth and detailed. But of course, that's harder to analyse because it's difficult to note everything down that's happening.
So what do we mean by covert and overt observations?
So covert observations, the simple way to remember it, because the word covert sounds like cover, is it's undercover. So participants don't realise they're being observed, they're unaware. So reduces demand characteristics and social desirability because they act more naturally. But that leaves us with an issue of ethics because we haven't got informed consent to observe them. And we have to be really careful that we don't invade people's privacy when we're doing a covert observation. The general rule is it's perfectly okay to observe people in a public place where they can reasonably expect that other people could be observing their behaviour. What we can't do in psychological research, though, is we can't record their behaviour with a video camera or an audio recorder if we haven't got their consent. So we can't record a covert observation. Overt observations means out in the open. So the participants are aware they're being observed. You've asked for consent beforehand, so it's more ethical. They've given their consent, they're quite happy to be observed. But of course, demand characteristics and social desirability are a big issue then. I'm sure some of you will remember how different your teachers act when there's an Ofsted inspector in the room. Their behaviour might not be what you'd normally see them doing in a classroom.
But what's participant observation?
Participant observation is when the researcher is part of the action they are observing. So it's a much more natural arrangement. But it is very difficult to take notes when you're joining in. And of course, investigator effects are a big issue. I remember when I was studying psychology and I was asked to do a participant observation as part of my research. And I decided to observe my family at mealtime. And I ended up trying to say outrageous things just to provoke them because nobody was doing anything. They were just shoveling their food in and it was really boring. Of course, that is investigator effects.
So what are time and event sampling?
Students get very mixed up with time and event sampling. I think it's unfortunate that we use the word sampling, but we've got to remember it's very different to sampling our participants. You know, we're talking about sampling methods. Time and event sampling are about sampling behaviour. So event sampling is probably the easiest to understand. That's when we're observing a particular chosen behaviour and recording it every time it occurs. And usually event sampling is synonymous with a structured observation. We're observing certain events. Time sampling observes and records behaviour at a set or prescribed time interval that the researcher decides beforehand. So it might be every 10 seconds. Bandura, for example, used time sampling and observed the children every 5 seconds. So it's having a set time, right, I'm going to observe now. So that's what time sampling is. Again, it's not that one's better than the other, it just depends what you're doing.
So how can we ensure an observation is reliable?
We have a unique problem with observations, and that's because they are a snapshot study, which means they're a moment in time. Once we've done that observation, we can't repeat it because it would be a different time, different people, it just wouldn't be the same. So it's not possible to repeat it in the same way we can an experiment. So we have to use inter-rater reliability. And this involves having 2 or more observers. They need to be trained in the same way, all have the same instructions so they know what they're looking for. And at the end of the observation, we compare their recordings or their notes, and we see how much they agree. So the norm is if 80% of the total observations agree, and we call that the 80% concordance rate, then we can say that the data has high inter-rater reliability. So we can say then that our observation of behaviour is reliable.
Oh, that's excellent, Deb. Thank you very much. I think that covers observations.
Thank you very much, Deb Gajic, for your insights into psychological research and for this episode on observations.